My name is Gavin Evans, and this is my review of Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. And this is a movie I was really looking forward to. I hate all the Mila Jovovich movies, and when I heard that they were rebooting this franchise, I'm like, yes, this is a franchise that needs to be rebooted because there was so much potential within it. I heard they were adapting the first two games. I'm like, okay, great, they're about to get it right. And then I saw the first trailer and I'm just like, ooh, they're not about to get it right. That was a really bad trailer, and it became clear to me that this was going to be a bad movie, but I was hoping for at least entertaining schlock. And this movie is really bad. It's another huge disappointment. Now I will say I watched this movie by myself on a Friday night, but if I had some friends over and we were having a few drinks just making fun of this movie, I feel like I could have had a good time with it. There are some locations in this movie that looks like they were pulled directly from the game, so I appreciate that. And there's one moment where they're getting attacked in the mansion and it's dark and all the light comes from the guns firing, and I thought that was actually a really well directed moment. But that's as positive as I can get on it. Now, I played the second game a few months ago and I really loved it, and I'm just like, okay, I'm excited to see how they adapt it. And I have to say that they just totally messed it up. Completely. This review will have spoilers, by the way, so if you haven't seen it, go ahead and watch it, then come back and watch my review because I will be going in depth. But the fact that they adapted the second game and I just feel like we hardly got anything that was in it is such a huge disappointment. Do you know what the best thing about that second game is? It's Mr. X. He's terrifying. He gives you anxiety and he stresses you out. And I was excited to see how he would play a role in this story. And he doesn't. He's not in this game at all. Completely non-existent. And like when I was an hour and a half into this movie and it became clear he wasn't going to be in it, I'm just like, why? Like, why? Oh, just a bafflingly awful decision. Also, in the second game, there's a character, the little girl, her name is Sherry, and she plays a huge role in that game. I don't think everything about her character works for me in the game, but she is meant to serve as the heart and the soul of it. And she's almost entirely absent from this movie. So I'm just like, okay, they screwed that up too. And okay, I'm not going to claim to be a Resident Evil expert, but the character Leon, the way he was portrayed in this movie, to my memory, wasn't at all how he was portrayed in the game. Like, I remember him being smart and competent, but here he's like the dumb idiot in the office. So it feels like they got that character completely wrong from what I remember of him. So it's a terrible adaptation of Resident Evil 2, but how is it as a movie? It's absolutely terrible, and I knew that from the opening scene. Because the movie has this opening scene, and it's building tension pretty decently, and then you get the worst jump scare just coming out of nowhere. And I'm just like, oh man, it's going to be one of these movies, isn't it? And indeed it was. That set the groundwork for this entire movie right there. And then you get introduced to all these characters, and oh my goodness, just the way they talk to them. I'm like, hello, I am Jill Valentine. Hello, I'm Leon Kennedy. Hello, I'm Claire Radford. Hello, I'm Chris Radford. Hey, Claire, you left 5 years ago when this happened, and that left me upset. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, like the writing is abysmal. The way they're talking to each other, the way that they're kind of winking at the camera as they're saying their names was just awful. And then you get non-stop exposition dump after exposition dump, and it's just all terribly handled. All of it. And I knew in that moment that this movie was going to be awful. And then there's one scene where Claire gets attacked by these two zombies, and they're just like, you need help. And then she just gets up and runs away. And that just wasn't satisfying to me. It's just like, okay, it's the beginning of the movie. You're about to begin with a good action sequence. And no, she just runs away. I'm just like, oh my goodness. And then they're trying to like sell you that like this is the end of Raccoon City. And I don't know if there's ever been a city in any movie ever that feels as empty, as lifeless, as completely void as this one does. You see almost nobody in the streets. There's just nothing going on in this city that isn't happening to the main characters. And because of that, the entire movie feels lifeless. And then there's this alarm going off, and Claire is driving through the streets, and there's like no one else there. The only other person we see is the main bad guy. So this entire city just feels completely lifeless. There's no one else on the streets. So it feels like everything that's happening in this city is happening to the main characters and nobody else. And you just expect to feel some sort of chaos and panic, but you feel nothing. So that entire element of the movie was severely underwhelming. And another frustrating angle of this movie is that as a whole movie, it completely fails. This movie is never remotely scary. It's definitely bloody in moments, but never scary. And when I was playing the second game, my favorite element of it, besides Mr. X, was just the stress and the tension and just feeling outnumbered, not having enough ammo, and they didn't lean into that at all. Resident Evil 2 is a terrifying game, and I just wish they brought that over into this movie. Like, you have all the potential in the world to build atmosphere, to build tension, to have some great monster horror, to even have some well-delivered jump scares, and you could have some great body horror. And this movie just has none of that. For goodness sakes, there's moments where I was questioning what tone is he going for. Because ever since Guardians of the Galaxy, lots of filmmakers have leaned into soundtracks way more than they used to. And there's one scene where this guy's driving in the streets, listening to Any Way You Want It. And just the actual execution of that scene, it just doesn't belong in this kind of movie. In fact, every soundtrack choice doesn't belong in this kind of movie. Instead of having some great atmospheric music that builds tension or whatever, they just try to make it feel like a generic action movie, and it doesn't work. So I didn't like any of those choices. You know, the director of this movie also directed The Stranger's Prey at Night, which I thought was a bad movie. But there's one great scene in that movie by the pool, and I'm thinking that he was trying to carry that over into this movie, and it just doesn't fit the vibe of it. So this movie doesn't work as a horror movie, but does it work as an action movie? No, the action is as underwhelming as it could be. It's never well shot, it's never intense, it's just the most mediocre action that could have possibly existed. And yeah, that was really underwhelming. But how is the story? Abysmal. This is a terribly written movie. You know, they start setting up the first game and then the second game. And, you know, you got the characters going off to the Spencer mansion. You've got Claire making her way to the police station with Leon. And I'm just like, okay, it's taking a while to get there, but I can't wait until we get there. And by the time that everyone was where they're supposed to be for their story, I actually checked how long I was into the movie. And I was 55 minutes in. So it takes almost an hour to get the story going in this movie. That means this movie is terribly paced and terribly written. Because the whole thing that people want to see this movie is that they want to see the first and second game adapted. And you don't even get that until an hour into this movie. And the build-up up until that point isn't even remotely decent. These characters are all as boring as they come. There is nobody that stands out in any way positively. I'm not saying that these acting choices were bad, but I will say that every single actor in this movie was incredibly dull. No one gives a good performance in this movie. I was hoping at least one actor would be a bit more over the top, would have a bit more life in their performance, but no, nobody does. Every single performance is flat. The CGI in this movie is also incredibly bad. It looks really bad. It looks like this would have came out in the early 2000s, so there's really no excuse for this movie to look as bad as it does. And then there's also two characters I want to talk about real quick. The first one is Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor gets introduced in the opening scene of this movie, and I've never played the original game all the way through, so I'm not familiar with this character. I don't know what kind of role she plays into the games. But I was just like, okay, I'm curious to see what they do here. She does have a slightly menacing look to her. And she just ends up doing nothing in this movie. She's introduced in the opening scene, and then we skip 20 years later, and I guess she's still just walking around that orphanage like she was 20 years ago, and then she just opens the door for them. That was the entire purpose of this character. Oh my goodness. And then we get the main bad guy. What's his name again? Morgan or something like that? Terribly handled. Terribly written character. He's not even a villain until the very end of this movie. We see him at the beginning, and then again at the end to be the big baddie at the end. And he does nothing for the majority of this movie. And he's just as generic as they come. Then in the last act, we see him inject himself with something that we don't know what it is, and then he starts mutating, and there's a big fight where he ends up getting killed, and I'm just like, okay, that feels like a complete waste of his character. But then he comes back as this giant monster, and no, it just doesn't work. What they should have done is have him inject himself with this thing early on, and we see him mutate as the movie progresses. So anytime you face him, he's slightly more bigger, he's slightly more frightening, and he's a bigger threat. Kind of like what the second game did. Because the way they try to do that escalation of his appearance and his character all within 10 minutes didn't work for me at all. And the Umbrella Company itself has no role in this story. They have no presence in it. It feels like an unneeded fact about who's behind everything. Like how everything starts to happen in this movie just has no weight behind it. If you take a great story like Arcane Season 1, there's a scene early on in the first episode where we've got Powder, Vi, Clago, and Milo trying to steal some stuff from an apartment. And it could be just a generic way to begin the show, to begin the season. But in fact, everything that happens in the show from that point forward happens as a result of something as small as stealing some stuff from an apartment. So it has, in that opening scene, has importance to it. It sets off a chain of events. And you get none of that here. Because the only reason anything happens in this movie is because the screenwriters decided so. There's no urgency to it. There's no real stakes because of that. Why is this city why is everyone turning into zombies now? Because the script says so. Why is this character going here now? Because the script says so. And it's just the laziest kind of writing. Another character I didn't like in this movie was Whisker, and everything they were trying to do with his character is just beyond stupid. Like, they were trying to treat this character like a real villain, like he betrayed everyone. But all he does is leave the mansion 5 minutes before anyone else. So that had no weight to it either. But one big issue of this movie that I haven't yet talked about, which is really everything wrong with this movie, is that everything in this movie feels incredibly off. Nothing feels natural. It all feels like actors delivering lines on a script. I've already mentioned that this movie has an incredibly cheap look to it. It looks like a fan-made movie on YouTube. But just the way people deliver their lines, it all feels off. No one feels like an actual person in it. There's one line where Leon asks Claire, I bet you're wondering what a guy like me am doing in a position like this. Me too. And I get what they're trying to do there. They're trying to show that the character is out of his element. But just the actual execution of that moment feels so incredibly off. And there's another moment where we see this prisoner, who we've only seen on the videotape up until this point, but he's locked up behind bars, and they should have shown that in the first act of this movie. And he's just like, hey man, you gotta let me out. This is what's happening. And then eventually he convinces Leon to let him out. And Only in that moment does he get attacked by a zombie and the zombie gets out. So that felt incredibly contrived. But then Claire goes ahead and kills the zombie, no problems. See that the guy is on the videotape she saw earlier. And that's just it. That's the end of the scene. The guy's dead, the zombie's dead. What was the point of it? And everything just feels off. Everything. My goodness, even the way this movie ends. This movie kind of just ends because it decides to end. They escape Raccoon City. Okay, time to wrap up the movie now. There's not a single character arc within this movie. So there's not a single bit of story that feels wrapped up in that moment. It just ends. My goodness, look, I want to love this movie. I love the second and third game. I think they're really intense, thrilling games, and I would love to see a good adaptation. I know Netflix has a TV show coming out this year, and I hope they do a better job. But man, this movie did not work for me in any way. It's terribly written, directed, acted. There's just nothing about this movie that works. The introduction to these characters is awful. The way that each character is handled is awful. It's never scary. You never feel the stakes or the tension. It's just, and worst of all, it doesn't even honor the games. It doesn't have what makes the game so special in this story. Look, the truth is, this movie probably deserves a 1 out of 10. I'm gonna go a bit higher because, like I said, I feel like I could have fun with this movie if I was having a few drinks with a few buddies. I feel like that could make this movie a bit more entertaining. But that said, it is still a terrible movie, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and give Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City a 3 out of 10. The other title would have been Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. But what did you think of this movie? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you like, make sure you comment, make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned for some more videos soon, and Gavin out.